Good evening, everyone. Good evening, panelists and our audience. How good to see you. Welcome. And we're here this evening because we're talking about AI and the future of education, even though you're saying to yourself, no, this place is about the past of education. So, sorry. What I'd like to say is, first of all, Enoch Turner Schoolhouse Foundation does this kind of programming regularly, and one of our collaborators is our coordinator of this program, Dr. Paul Axelrod. I also want to say that it's our 175th anniversary, and so feel free to enjoy that celebration going on into the rest of the year. To begin with, let me do the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. As I said, this program is looking into the future of education in the context of AI. Paul Axelrod is a historian of education, a professor emeritus, and the former dean of the Faculty of Education at York University. This is the third series of educational issues that Paul has organized for us. Paul, welcome.
Thank you. So welcome to the second of our two-part series on AI and the future of education. In this program, we're examining the implications of AI in both K-12 and post-secondary institutions, shedding light on the pertinent, consequential, and sometimes controversial aspects of this rapidly evolving field. I'm guessing that college and university students are incorporating AI into their academic lives more quickly and more easily than many of their teachers and professors. How should educators be addressing the use of AI? What are the creative ways it can be employed in the classroom? What are the dangers? Last week, we explored AI's use or potential use in elementary and secondary education. Tonight, we focus on post-secondary education with a panel of experts who use AI and even more impressively appear to understand it. Let me confess something. I asked ChatGPT to rewrite the above paragraph in an engaging and humorous way. In exactly 5 seconds, it produced the following. Welcome back, savvy scholars, to the electrifying sequel of our brain-bending series, AI and the Future of Education. Get ready to embark on another roller coaster ride through the wild world of artificial intelligence, where we'll be dissecting its impact on both the kiddie classroom and the hallowed halls of higher learning. Spoiler alert, it's not just about robots doing math homework anymore. Now, I'm no mind reader, but it seems like our students are mastering AI faster than you can say, Siri, do my homework. But hold on to your textbooks, because we've got some burning questions to tackle. How on earth do we guide our educators and families through this AI maze? Can we sprinkle some creative AI fairy dust in the classroom without accidentally summoning a robot uprising? And let's not forget the lurking dangers, folks. Last time, we took a magnifying glass to AI's role in elementary and secondary education. But tonight, brace yourselves for the post-secondary plunge. We've assembled a crack team of AI aficionados who not only wield its power, but actually understand what they're doing. So sit back, relax, and let's decode this digital enigma together. Not bad, eh? I don't exactly know who you're clapping for, but there we go.
For both you and the AI.
Our moderator will introduce tonight's panelists. So let me introduce the moderator, Dr. Claire Brett, Professor Emerita, University of Toronto. Claire is former chair of the Department of Curriculum, Teaching and Learning at OISE University of Toronto, and for the last 30 years, she's been involved in a wide variety of research projects in the design of blended and online learning environments in classrooms, offering many of her graduate courses online. The author of numerous articles and conference presentations, Claire co-leads the Pepper project, which asks the question, what does online interaction really contribute to the online learning experience? She's the co-editor of a recent book called Handbook of Research on Online Discussion-Based Teaching Methods. Claire, thank you, and over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm not going to try and compete with ChatGPT. Mine is going to be much more banal in its introductions. But I do want to welcome you all here, both here and for the people joining us online. And the first session was really fascinating, and I'm so glad that we're doing a second one on post-secondary education, because it really is very thought-provoking. So I'm really looking forward to tonight as well. And we're going to, just a reminder, we'll hear from each of our panelists for not more than 15 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion with panelists and audience members online and here in this wonderful setting. So we'll save the questions though till the end. So write them down so that you don't forget. So I'll start with introductions. We've got another 3 very strong researchers with very different roles and focuses from different institutions and looking at AI in very different educational settings. So to start us off, Dr. Ian Milligan, who is a professor of history at the University of Waterloo, where he also serves as the Associate Vice President, Research Oversight and Analysis. In his administrative role, Dr. Milligan provides campus leadership for research oversight and compliance and is the campus research integrity lead. So I will turn it over to him.
Perfect.
Oh, no, I haven't told you the title, have I? That's my bit.
I can tell them that. No.
Okay, well, I'll give them a foretaste. So generative AI and research. How can researchers responsibly harness this new technology?
Thank you. Great, thanks everybody. Happy to be here to join you all to talk about generative AI and research and how researchers can responsibly harness this new technology. So my first disclaimer will just be, these are my personal views. They're not the official views of my employer. So you can blame me, not the University of Waterloo. Now, like Paul did, I thought the first thing I should do is, of course, just let the AI handle my talk. And so I went to ChatGPT. Because I'm a nerd, I say hello. I like to get a little bit of conversation going with our artificial friends. And then I explain, I'm about to give a talk at the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse. Can you tell me a little bit about its history? And by the way, could you also then write me a talk about the responsible use of artificial intelligence? And I like this because, it starts thinking. And then it will provide us with a fairly passable Wikipedia-level introduction of the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse. So this is why when Paul asked me today if I knew about the schoolhouse, I could say that it was founded by a brewer. I knew it only from that and the plaque outside. And then, of course, it segues into a talk on the responsible use of AI, which you're all about to hear. In the seriousness, as a recap, ChatGPT hasn't been around that long. And I'll talk a little bit about how I'm using that term, but it really took the world by storm on November 30th when it launched. And it launched at a time in post-secondary, as I'll mention, that it effectively derailed the plans of countless take-home exam professors who realized something was changing in their classrooms. And as I'll note in a few seconds, academics got excited. They got a little too excited about what I think this technology could do when it comes to their own research agendas. Now, before I go into that, I wanted to give just a little bit of a generative AI in a nutshell, and then I can be corrected by the computer scientist who I'm terrified to be sitting next to about this. And that's effectively that the AI that we're talking about today, and we'll call it ChatGPT, GPT-4, GPT, whatever, are based on large language models. And these are effectively prediction engines at scale that are based on a series of games. And so, for example, it could be complete the sentence. So you have a sentence like this. After graduating from the University of Waterloo, the student was, well, it's not going to be the word umbrella. That doesn't make any sense. Could be employed. could be happy, could be resigned, could be exuberant, could be dismayed, could be successful. And there's different probabilities attached to those words. Or it could be a fill in the blank. After attending his blank class, John knew more about the Roman Empire. Maybe that was his math class, probably not. Maybe his classics class, could be a history class, could be an elementary class, could be an extracurricular class. And so it's activities like this scaled up in larger context windows that really underpin these large language models. And why they're so powerful is that they're trained on these extremely large corpora of information, which is why their predictions are generally good and they're generally scary. And they've been trained on things like, we know, for example, Wikipedia, Common Crawl, which would be a collection of websites, which is this monumental source of human culture and activity. And as I'll mention in the next slide, for the case of many of our commercial LLMs, we don't really know. And we know that these training data bias the data set in various ways. For example, linguistic bias, one training data set I saw, probably for one of these open models, you might be something like 80% English language, 10% code, and then that 10% is the rest of languages, from French, German on down to extremely small training corpora for the vast majority of the world's many, many languages. Now it comes in many shapes and sizes. I'll probably colloquially and somewhat annoyingly probably to technical colleagues refer to it all as ChatGPT. But OpenAI's ChatGPT, which you saw my little screen video of that, or Microsoft Copilot, which many of us on Microsoft campuses are increasingly used, they're both based on this same GPT-4 model. And that GPT-4 model, it almost boggles comprehension. The training cost may have exceeded something like $100 million to train, has perhaps 1 to 1.7 trillion parameters. And as I say here, a lot of this is a black box, because if you read the technical paper for GPT-4, you effectively see that this report contains no further details about the infrastructure, the architecture, the hardware, the training compute, the data construction, the training method, or similar. And so that's my very quick introduction to say that even though LLMs don't think, they seem like they do. And they don't think. You've seen how they work, hopefully, in this very tortured historical interpretation of how an LLM works, but it's not thinking. It's doing prediction at scale. And so academics got really excited starting in November 2022. And the first thing they did was they began to add ChatGPT as an author. A search on Google Scholar, if you do a search for author ChatGPT, you start to see a lot of publications, some in marginal venues, some in surprisingly high-profile venues, most from that excitement period of early 2023. And I'd say there was a very quick reaction from the research community and a very strong reaction from the research administration community that you can't do that. Authors take responsibility for what they write. Authors are accountable for what they write. ChatGPT cannot take responsibility. ChatGPT cannot be accountable. And so this was like a brief little experiment. People started adding ChatGPT as an author, effectively saying, isn't that cute? And we slapped their wrists and we said, stop that right now. ChatGPT is not an author. And so if we were excited and we were starting to add ChatGPT as an author, researchers also began to worry. And so as I said, I did have colleagues who had take-home exams, pretty rote history, not the best pedagogy maybe, in December of 2022. And they started texting me saying, Ian, something terrible is happening. All of my students, or at least a third of my students, seem to be doing something that's really, really weird. And so after that initial period of panic, we've seen real wide pedagogical approaches where we've seen some faculty embracing it, saying, let's use AI everywhere. Some saying, let's use it in selective contexts, and some saying, don't use it at all. And I think the people in the toughest position are, for example, my colleagues who do introductory programming, things that ChatGPT can knock out of the park really, really quickly, but the painstaking way of, say, learning how to construct something rote and boring is foundational for what's going to follow. And so on the education side of the house, there was quite a bit of attention paid towards academic integrity. And then on the research side of the house, we began to worry about research integrity. Now, those two kind of seem like synonyms, academic integrity, research integrity, but they're not synonyms. And so research integrity in many countries is regulated. So here in Canada, while I do report to the University of Waterloo, in many of my contexts, I'm in constant communication with Ottawa, because Ottawa cares about the integrity of our research that they fund here in Canada. And that's because if we start letting things like ChatGPT run unfettered in our research enterprise, we begin to put the entire scholarly record at stake. And so the example I use when I explain to colleagues the difference between academic integrity and research integrity is that academic integrity affects the course learning objectives of a course. If someone plagiarizes in a course, it's bad for the student, it's bad for the professor. If somebody falsifies data in a medical journal or something slips in that someone doesn't understand what it is, it enters the scholarly record, we have a bad day for society. We have very high profile examples of research integrity mishaps, reducing vaccine uptake around the world as a result of bad research. And we're still trying to figure out the extent to which researchers are using ChatGPT, because it's very hard to detect ChatGPT, and it's very hard to run a study where people disclose that they're using ChatGPT. But we're beginning to see in certain environments such as this, this is a series of ACM and IEEE computer science conferences. A study was carried out. Let's look to see if we think these faculty members are using ChatGPT to review the work of their colleagues. And this initial preprint showed that somewhere between 6.5% to 16.9% of the text submitted as peer reviews, usually from those faculty members who are doing it right at the deadline, usually those faculty members who don't normally write great reviews, were thinking that they're beginning to use ChatGPT to carry out assessment of their colleagues, which is a sort of canary in the coal mine that something bad is happening in the enterprise. And this worries me because it's not really reasoning. Again, it's a prediction engine. This isn't some magical, all thinking and all reasoning person. It is a prediction model that is really drawing on a corpus of past information. And so it worries me not just from an intellectual property perspective, but if a researcher is operating, or you're operating, at the frontier of human knowledge, you're seeing something that no human has ever seen before, and you're using an AI to help evaluate it, the AI has never seen it before. But it's not going to tell you, it's going to wing it. Now, we know that diligent researchers are using it to support scientific research. So I use this example, public data set of 600 emails, so there's no intellectual property concerns. And you can upload it into GPT-4, and 600 emails, it begins to describe the data set, begins to posit hypotheses around the words, lets me dig into various content themes. Things that I could do on my own, I could read 600 emails, or I could write other programs to do it for me. But in this case, ChatGPT does it in 10 seconds. But it's hard to trust. It's as if I'm talking to a layperson who read all my sources, but it's really hard for me to verify, and it's really hard for me to take it from that next step to citing it in a peer-reviewed paper, because I don't fully trust it. And if we don't trust it, that's going to be a problem. It certainly excels at code generation. Here, I don't expect you to read it, but I gave it an example of an HTML web scraper, the kind of thing I could do myself, but I'm a little bit rusty because I write emails all day. But I could say, here's some parameters, I want you to come up with the code to do it, and it does it. But we know, and I like this example, is that effectively ChatGPT is great at designing code that are easy problems and are problems that have occurred in the past before its training data set. So there was this example here using code force problems. It had a 100% track record of solving code force problems that were published pre-2021, and then a 0% track record of solving these very sophisticated programming problems in the post-2021 area. And again, that underscores it's not thinking. It's as if you've got a student who has no real theoretical grasp of the material, but has a photographic memory and access to all of your notes. They don't understand it, but it can access that information. And so it often gets confused. And of course, there's one other big problem, which is that it's allegedly predicated on an alleged theft of intellectual property. Talking to a colleague who works in this space, we kind of joke, and then we realized we weren't joking, is that effectively it's one of the largest alleged thefts of all time of intellectual property. It's got tons of copyrighted materials in there. It knows plot twists on book pages that it shouldn't know had it respected copyright. And there's, of course, current litigation ongoing around the degree to which this was based on a theft of intellectual property. And then crucially, it could all fall apart. The more we use large language models, I'm afraid as a historian how everything will begin to get flooded by material that's being generated by LLMs. That will form the training data for the next generation of it. And because words, and here's where the computer scientists might know better than me, but effectively, I suspect many of the AI detectors detect by finding the commonality of words. When I speak, I tend to use words that only I would use, but you're not going to tend to see that in AI-generated material. And so the next time you train material on AI material, it's using more common words, more common words, more common words, and eventually it genuinely turns into just gibberish because it's just being trained on increasingly common words. And I worry about the cultural record. LLMs are flooding the web, and in my own day job, we joke about, you can date steel to before the advent of atomic weapons. We talk about that low background steel. You go find a shipwreck and you dig it up and you use it in particular applications. Will one day we look back at data pre-2023 and say, hey, that was probably written by a human, and post-2023 say, that was probably written by a machine. So as I come to the end of my talk today, I think there's a lot of issues. There's issues with using generative AI in research. It's based on this massive intellectual property theft. They're not intelligent, they're predicting, which is bad when you're working at the frontier of human knowledge and tackling novel problems. But of course, we're going to use them. They do amazing work. They do technical work very, very nicely. They summarize, they parse, they do all of these amazing things that you'll see here tonight. And so I think for researchers, we're in the midst of confusion. We have too much optimism and we have too much fear. So in general, we're still working in this sort of gray zone. The Canadian government has given guidance saying, if you're working on research, you should at least disclose if you're using AI. We're telling our researchers when they're evaluating work, don't do what those computer scientists have begun to do in their conferences. Don't start turning over your reviews to AIs. But they're using it mostly in the vein of, we don't want you to lose intellectual control of that material. We don't want you to have it uploaded to the cloud. And I'm really worried about privacy. And I think we still don't know what that is. We don't know, is it going to be like spell check or Grammarly? Is it going to be built into Microsoft Word? Is that okay? Or is it these chat interfaces that we have to worry about? And then crucially, we worry about privacy, but I don't think privacy is the main concern. I think it really is, we work at the edge of human knowledge. We generate intellectual property. We need to respect intellectual property, and we need to understand these limitations. In other words, we're going to use them, but we need to understand how we're going to use them. We need to understand that they're not reasoning, that they're on copyright theft, they're not going to replace scholars. Training data is how they understand the world, but so is bias as a concern, so are temporal limitations. And I'm at time, so I'm just going to say we need to use them with caution. We need to reflect around the kind of world that we want and the impact that AI is going to have on human knowledge. So at that point, I'll thank you all and then turn it over to Peter.
Okay, thank you. That was a really great one to start with, actually. I think it does set up nicely the next two. So, and I'll introduce our second speaker, Dr. Peter Lewis. He holds a Canada Research Chair in Trustworthy Artificial Intelligence at the Ontario Tech University, where he is an associate professor and leads the Trustworthy AI Lab. His research advances aspects of trust and self-awareness and socially intelligent systems. And drawing on extensive experience applying AI commercially, he's interested in where AI meets society and how that relationship can work well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And my title slide doesn't have the title of my talk on, and so I don't know quite what happened there, but anyway. Anyway, it's great to be here today. So I was going to begin with a short introduction to some of these tools, and Ian's done a fantastic job. I think the ordering has worked out really well here in giving an overview of what some of these tools are. So, I think that probably a lot of people here, well, certainly now, will be familiar with the idea of ChatGPT, and it is not the only one of these. So there are several of these kinds of models and tools out there. So another one you can go and play with online is called Perplexity, one that has taken some traction in universities. And there are open source models as well, like things like Llama that comes from Meta, Mistral, and various others. And these open source ones. You can essentially, if you've got the know-how or the people, then you can build them into your own applications and build your own ChatGPT style tools on top of these kinds of large language model platforms. So I was going to begin with a little, kicking it off with something, and I thought, we've seen some of the creative, in quotes, scare quotes, power of some of these models. So I actually thought I'd begin this by asking it to write a poem about the transformative power of education, to see how that might set the scene here. And it does pretty well. So I'm not a poet, I'm not someone who's a critic of poems, but it's, in realms where dreams take flight, education's might, a beacon, a guide through the darkest night, right? So it's rhyming, it's using metaphor, it's doing some pretty cool things, actually, given that it is literally just a prediction model. One of the things that I might want to do if I was a student, a graduate student perhaps, or a researcher, is I might say, could you write me a literature review on trustworthy AI, please? And see what it come up with. So I'm going to apologize in advance for this. These slides have quite a lot of text on because of the nature of this talk. I do not expect everybody to read them. But essentially, I'm going to point a few things out. So it's picked up on some important themes here. So it's picked up on ethics, fairness, accountability, transparency. It's put in some citations here from people like Floridian Cowles and various other people. And these are, I don't know why it's chosen these papers rather than any others, but they're reasonable things that you might expect to see in an introduction, in an essay like this. There's one thing there that's not quite right. So this paper here by Veal and Binns is relevant, but it is nothing to do with accountability mechanisms or how to attribute responsibility. It's an analysis of how to measure fairness, that paper. So it knew that it was relevant, but it's completely misunderstood what the paper was about. And there's something else I want to point out here, which is a little bit funny. The word delve has appeared here. So these people delve into interpretable machine learning models. And we were talking about detecting things like ChatGPT. You might be surprised to learn that the word delve has had a real resurgence in recent years because of things like the use of ChatGPT. So this chart here shows the number of papers with the word delve in the title or abstract is on its way to being 1% of all academic papers at the moment. So this is quite an interesting kind of trend in the use of language in research, right? I talked a little bit about ChatGPT. I was going to talk about Perplexity as well. So Perplexity is a little bit different. It's an example of something that uses what's often called RAG, which is retrieval augmented generation. So this is not just relying on what it was trained on, but actually when you type in a query, so here I've, for example, asked it to summarize the work of a professor in my research field, something one of my graduate students might want to do, for example, Jeremy Pitt here. Could you summarize this? And what it's done here is it's gone off and done a web search. It's found some sources, it's listed those sources along the top of the screen here, and then it has generated some text based on the content of those, okay? So this is kind of interesting. So it's telling me that he's a professor at Imperial College London, he's specializes in these different areas of research, which is pretty much correct. And then I was like, and it uses the word delve as well. So, but what's Jeremy Pitt delving into? Jeremy Pitt is delving into the changing nature of human adjudication, apparently. And now I know Jeremy's work really well. And I was like, he doesn't work on that. So I thought, this is a bit strange. So I said, well, why did you tell me that he works on the changing nature of human adjudication? And it's given me an answer. The answer itself doesn't matter. But what's interesting here is it's now picked up on some completely different sources which are not to do with him at all, and they weren't in the previous answer, right? So this is the kind of experience, if you're a graduate student, you might end up having. So I was just, okay, this is nonsense, right? So I said, that's not true. And it's apologized, and then says, yes, I was wrong, he doesn't do this. So it didn't take much convincing, it didn't really defend itself, right? And so I'm curious, I said, why did you make this mistake, right? And it said it failed due to a misinterpretation of the information available. Okay. So as Ian was saying, this doesn't seem like a particularly trustworthy thing for, say, a graduate student or a researcher to be engaging with, unless you already know what you're looking for, right? So I think, the thing I wanted to really end this part of it with was to, I asked it, you wouldn't have noticed the mistake if I hadn't pointed it out, and it agreed with me that it wouldn't have known about that. Yes, does not have the capability to self-correct. Now, what's really funny about this was that I then thought, well, where did it get this from, right? So I went off and I actually found a 2019 magazine article that Jeremy Pitt was a co-author on, with a subtitle, The Changing Nature of Human Adjudication. It turns out that he was a co-author on this completely unrelated article to the rest of his work, which is about the introduction of VAR in soccer, right? Video refereeing. I don't know why it would pick up on this. I actually had to search explicitly for that to even find it, knowing that I'd got those terms. Okay, so that was an interesting experience. But anyway, so where are we? So we know that at the moment, I think as Ian has pointed out, faculty are experimenting with AI tools in all sorts of different ways. Some of them are very excited and perhaps over-optimistic. Others are actually quite worried. Researchers are unsure about what they should make of it, how they should use it, what the ethics of that are. We know that staff, admin staff, universities and colleges are using it. We also believe, I don't have evidence for it, we believe that's underreported, that it's probably being more widely used than we think. We do know for sure that many students, perhaps even a majority of students in some disciplines, are already using these tools. So this is important to acknowledge. And there are uses that work well, and we're going to see an example of one in a moment, I think. So, some of the things that these tools can do very, very well, it turns out that language prediction is really useful for. Things like paraphrasing, changing tone of voice, formal language support, and things like grammar can be very useful for international students, for example. Exploring arguments, especially well-known, well-rehearsed arguments that you might find in the literature. We often talk about rubber ducking in programming, for example, where you kind of actually try and talk to a rubber duck on your desk about what's going on, and it's just the act of articulating it yourself often helps you to walk through something. So you can use it for things like that. Generating questions, quiz questions from content, planning projects, things like that. And then there's another class of things that, with some caveats, I think, it can also sometimes be quite useful for. So things like brainstorming, outlining, generating documents if they're fairly standardized, exploring concepts, trying to understand concepts in a sort of interactive textbook kind of way. Mimicking people, this is quite a good educational use. So if you would like to teach people how to interact with a client or a patient or someone like that, or to do an interview, you can practice on one of these, like a role play, and writing computer code as well. It's reasonable at in some ways. So that second group, really, I've got a kind of an asterisk next to all of them, which is why I kind of put them out and highlighted them a little bit. I'd also just want to highlight that one of the things that we've become very used to with these tools is thinking about them like separate tools, like going to ChatGPT to use this thing, or going to Perplexity. And increasingly, I think we're already seeing it, but it will disappear into software, right? This will just be there in Excel doing, well, it already is, but in all the tools that you're normally using. So it won't seem like a discrete action to go and necessarily use one of these models. So I said there are caveats. One of those big caveats Ian already touched on, which is around the potential for plagiarism and copyright theft. So there are ongoing legal cases at the moment, including this one from the New York Times, which is probably the most high-profile one of these, suing OpenAI. Again, I don't expect you all to read this, but there's a large amount of direct similarity between the output of ChatGPT and a New York Times article here that was part of the brief that was submitted for this court case. We've also got evidence from organizations like CopyLeaks, which is a company that produces plagiarism detection software. And they found in one study that almost 60% of GPT 3.5's outputs contain some form of plagiarized content, whether that's direct text, whether that's paraphrased text, or minor changes to existing text. So there's this kind of myth that it's producing brand new novel content, and it's not really doing that, right? It's producing things that may appear new and may have some kind of level of, we could talk about the level of novelty or creativity, but in general, this is what happens. It's like a remix, right? I focused a lot on text. I also wanted to mention that there are other we've got multimodal models now, and we've got image models and audio models. One of the really kind of cool ones you can go and play with is called Midjourney. So there's a couple of examples here. Give me a cherry blossom treehouse, for example. It's quite a nice picture of that. Give me a fish tank tower. There's like fish swimming around in a skyscraper there. So they're nice, and they're kind of creative, and they're also sort of combinatorial, I would say. They're kind of like remixes of existing concepts, and they're very good at doing these things. But again, the plagiarism problem persists here as well. So if you ask Midjourney, for example, for a video game plumber, you're going to get something a bit like this, which is clearly copyright, right? So this is Mario. And then there are other sorts of slightly weirder kind of failures as well, right? So things like, if I ask for salmon jumping in the river, one possible outcome would be this, right? Or this is my favorite, I think. Jesus flipping over tables in the temple. Okay, so what's going on here? What's going on is these are technically correct, right? From a kind of a linguistic point of view, right? From a formal sense, but they lack any of the context or meaning that you or I would come, and that's why people laugh. That's why you laughed, because you have that context and that understanding, and this doesn't. So some observations about these kinds of things. They can often appear, yes, if you spotted them, they can often appear really smart, but have very kind of limited capabilities around reasoning. But what's really interesting is that they can fail in really unintuitive ways. The mental sort of scaffolding that we've got from interacting with humans for generations and evolved, we're then applying that to our interaction with these agent-like things. But they don't behave like that. They don't work like that. So the biases, the cognitive biases that we're bringing to things that are very useful when we're interacting with humans, they break when we're interacting with these, because the failure modes are very different. And that can be a source of risk, actually. So I've put this picture up here. If you hadn't spotted it, the unicorn's horn has impaled the man's head. And this is because they're not world simulators. So in this one, it doesn't have a model of the world to understand that the particular way it's put these elements together in this picture requires something to have happened, which is actually quite horrific, right? Whereas you or I could see that clearly. More relevant to education, there's no theory of mind in these models. It may appear like that sometimes, but there certainly isn't. And I would encourage you to think what an educator would be like if they did not possess the ability to engage in theory of mind in order to take the perspective of their students or understand what students' current mental model of the material was, for example. And also, tutoring, we're going to see an example of AI Tutor Pro in a moment, but, tutoring, I'll foreshadow a little bit, is not question answering. So to understand what I mean by that, ChatGPT is not a tutor, right? So if I say I'm having difficulty understanding the first law of thermodynamics, for example, which is what a student might say to a tutor, it just does the AI equivalent of kind of mansplaining what the first law of thermodynamics is at you, right? Not really very helpful from a pedagogic point of view. I'd like to end with two slides that just talk about bigger picture concerns and then advice. So some of my sort of bigger picture concerns around the use of AI in this. I think the first one, perhaps the biggest one, is actually around cognitive de-skilling. So if we are moving to a place where we do not expect students to learn how to write and construct arguments for themselves, but to essentially plumb things together that are produced by language models, what are we depriving them of? And if we are dumbing down and undermining those critical faculties by the way that we do this, what are the consequences for their engagement in things like democracy and civic participation if they essentially don't learn the tools of rhetoric and argumentation and articulation themselves? So that, for me, is a big one, which is not necessarily going to happen, but I think there's a big risk there. We talked already about privacy and confidentiality a little bit. We have these so-called hallucinations, which is not a great term, I think. I think confabulation is probably a more accurate term for this. They're not going away. It's not a bug that we will fix anytime soon. It's fundamental to the way these models work. We see bias in language, propagated in stereotypes. So one very simple example I came up with from my use of it was that it talked about women doctors, as if the word doctors doesn't already contain women, right, for example. And then there are strange attempts by the tech industry to overcome some of these. You could look at Google's Gemini thing from last month as an example of that. I'm also really interested to see how the economics of future AI play out. Everyone at the moment is throwing money at this, but when that moves to something a little bit more mature, I think the economics will very much depend on the way in which, how good these things are, essentially. So, if they turn out to be better than humans at tutoring, then I think that they'll probably become very expensive, and only the people with the money will be able to afford them. If it turns out that they're much worse than humans, then probably we'll have AI for most people, and the wealthy people will be able to afford proper tutors. And I think this is one of the risks that we also run. I'm aware of time, but I'd like to just end with one slide with some advice that I may give to people working in universities and colleges around this. So, if you're considering using AI, ask yourself what pedagogical purpose and value it will serve. How is it going to enhance the learning experience? If students are going to be cognitively offloading tasks to an AI, how is that going to affect the learning outcomes? I think we must know the answers to that before we go ahead and use it. Is it helping to develop and promote critical thinking skills, or is it undermining them by providing shortcuts? If you're deciding not to use artificial intelligence in your course, I think explain to the students why and help them to engage with that decision. As I've tried to illustrate with some of my funny examples, generally I think AI is fine to use when you can validate the answer for yourself, when you know what to expect. But when you don't, I think be cautious and don't necessarily consider it trustworthy. I think universities and colleges have an obligation at the moment to encourage AI literacy amongst all of the students and all of the staff, actually, all of their employees at the moment. We talked about co-authorship already. I think that goes without saying now, I hope. If you're using it as an instructor, please fact check things before you give it to anybody. And from a privacy point of view, please don't submit your students' work to ChatGPT, because you will be adding it without their consent potentially to OpenAI's data set, which I think would be very problematic. And if you're writing a syllabus, write in there, what is your policy on AI? How are you using it? Why are you using it in that way? And what do you expect the students will gain from its use? Okay, so that's my talk. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's great, really interesting questions, which I hope we'll take up in a moment. But first, we'll introduce Dr. Ron Austin, who's a Research Associate AI in Higher Education at Ontario's Contact North, where he's leading the development of innovative AI-based tools to support teaching and learning. A pioneer in educational technology research since the early days of the web, Dr. Austin is University Professor Emeritus, former Dean of Education, and founding director of the Institute for Research on Learning Technologies at York University. And his presentation is called Tutoring Reimagined, How AI is Revolutionizing Learning.
Thank you, Claire. A little different in terms of the title of my session, but certainly the same theme. So what I'm going to do tonight is bring us down to the ground and look at some of the real-world applications we can make of AI. Have you ever noticed, just driving around town, walking around town, seeing the number of tutoring schools, learning academies that are proliferating? You can hardly drive a block or two without seeing a strip mall with Kumon Learning, Little Einstein, and so on. So have you ever wondered why, though? I think that's the important question. Why are we seeing so many of these schools? Well, the simple answer is that, in fact, tutoring, one-on-one personalized tutoring is effective. There was a study done 4 decades ago by University of Chicago professor Benjamin Bloom. He compared students who were tutored individually with students who received regular classroom instruction. And he found, in fact, that students who were individually tutored scored 2 standard deviations higher than traditional instructed students. Putting that in more real-world terms, 2 standard deviations would mean that students in traditional instruction who are at the mean, or putting it the other way around, students who are getting individualized instruction, 95% of them scored better than the average in traditional instruction, 95% better than those in traditional instruction. So Bloom then set off a quest to find traditional classroom methods that can result in, if not the same, very similar high performance of students. Unfortunately, we haven't really achieved that, but I see there is some promise now and some potential of making individual tutoring, personalized tutoring, accessible to all. And I think we'll create some very significant headway in worldwide education if we do that and make these tools available. We've tried to do that for many decades. There was a tool that was started in the late 70s, went into the 90s, and folded in about 2010, called Plato. Claire nods. And this was a very serious attempt at having individual tutoring on a variety of subjects. And it was reasonably successful. It was a mainframe computer-based system initially. It took many hundreds and hundreds of hours to create new content, update the content, and it proved to be really impractical. However, it was a good tool during its time. Along the way, others have developed tools for tutoring. They were very often subject-specific. Updating them was a problem. very difficult to update, to add new topics to them, not too feasible in the long run. So then, as we know, in November 23, along came ChatGPT, OpenAI's ChatGPT 3.5. And at Contact North, in early 2023, January, February, we started saying, well, how can we make use of these generative AI tools? How can we make use of them to support student learning? Yes, students can go to the tools directly, but how can we build applications on top of ChatGPT and make that available to students to help with their learning? So the first several months, we worked on 2 tools, 2 apps, which are downloadable right now from the Google and Apple stores. And their apps, like one is to support students, a chat bot to support students in online learning skills, like how can I improve my grades in an online course, for instance. You enter that in and the tutor will come back with answers suggesting how you can improve your grades. I have trouble participating in discussion groups. What can I do? My grades are slipping. What can I do? Another one we've developed just shortly after that, now we're coming into about last summer, it was on assessing digital literacy skills. A very simple tool again to help students make these, all these are available freely. And then we said, now let's see what we can do in terms of a real tutoring tool. And so we began work last summer, well, earlier than that in the spring of last year, about a year ago from now actually, and launched a tool in the fall called AI Tutor Pro. And this tool I'm going to talk about some more tonight. AI Tutor Pro is an attempt to develop a tutoring tool on taking advantage of the vast knowledge base in ChatGPT. It's linked to the very latest version of ChatGPT, GPT 4.5. And what we have here is a tool that virtually, from what it says in the lead in here, anytime, anywhere, and any topic is literally true. And now I can add to that any language. You can use this tool in multiple languages as well. And by the way, all of our tools, though, are available in English and French versions, given that's part of Contact North's mission. So we see here in the screen, the welcome screen, 2 tools, 2 choices, very simple, very straightforward, and a video which rudely interrupted as I hit the mouse. And it gives an introduction to the tool. And but the first tool that I want to show you, though, is the check my knowledge and skills on any topic. It's essentially a chat bot where you're going to enter a topic, not a question, a topic, and it will come back and ask you questions about that topic. And if you don't know the answer, you can say that, I don't know the answer, help me, and it'll give you an explanation. It's question, answer, back and forth, just checking your understanding about a particular topic. And in the process, give you feedback and support you in that learning process. The other tool is, in many ways, a more interesting tool, Grow My Knowledge. That's assuming that you know something about the particular topic and you want to increase your understanding of that topic. And it acts as a Socratic tutor. It takes you from where you are and tries to build on that and help you scaffold your learning and improve your knowledge and skills on that particular topic. So let's take a look at the first tool, the Check My Knowledge tool. Here it is here. Again, we have an avatar explaining how to use the tool. And then you see in the chat bot the possibility of entering your topic. And this is the topic, history of the Berlin Wall, correct? I can't see it from here, nor can I see it up there, but I remember that that's what I put in, right? I got that right. So not knowing whether we would have reliable live connections tonight to the internet, I thought I would show a pre-recorded one that I did actually very recently at a conference in Berlin. So that was very relevant to them. But the history of the Berlin Wall, it's just an example of a topic you could put in. Okay, and so we put that in, and then right away the tutor responds with this particular response, and which unfortunately I can't see, and I hope it is readable to those of you who are, yeah, you can see it, okay. And then we start the process and carry on with the dialogue. It responds and gives an answer, responds, and gives an answer, gives you feedback. I think it'll be more meaningful when I do it live, as you'll see the nature of that dialogue. The next one, grow my knowledge, let's put in the same topic and then see what we're going to get. There's some options along the way, which I can show live, demonstrate live, and that will give you a sense of what those options are in terms of the language being used and so on. So this one, you see, it starts off a conversational approach to the topic. And we delve into that topic through Socratic style questioning. And it goes on to it, goes on, we carry on in the dialogue, and then we come up to the end, and we have the sort of the session. I said stop, and that was the end of it. So this then again is that kind of dialogue session. We have several other options. My colleagues mentioned the fact that you don't know necessarily where you're getting that information from for the answer, but we have another interesting option. Let's say you're an instructor and you want your students to learn about a paper that you've written, say. You have the option to upload that paper, and then the tutor will ask you questions only about that. The discussion will be restricted to that particular topic. So that becomes very powerful then. So we do get away, not entirely, from some of the issues of AI's hallucinating, potentially. It's asking only questions from what you've provided it. And so you avoid that. You keep the students focused on the particular topic, and I think it's a way that can be used very effectively. We're working on trying to increase the capacity of the system to take larger files. Right now, it is limited to some extent. You can also copy and paste text into the tool as well. So that's another quicker way, perhaps, to do it. Another option here, though, is, let's say a student had a transcript of a lecture, an online lecture, and they had a transcript of that lecture. The instructors, say, provided that through using Zoom, for instance, and that lecture transcript was there. Well, then a student could get that lecture transcript, copy and paste it into the tool, or else upload the tool, and they could check their understanding of that particular lecture, the material in that lecture. So it would work towards sort of the idea of mastering and fully understanding the topics and the content of that lecture. So some very interesting possibilities here. And so here's one that I worked at, which allowed us to, this was an article I took from, this is a more recent article. I copied and gave an example of this. What I did was copy an article from the Toronto Star, paste it in here, and then it was about cell phone use, the recent government policy. No, actually, this wasn't from the Star. It was from Ontario government press release. I copied and pasted in here. Being concerned about copyright, and I'll talk about that issue in a moment, I copied the Government of Ontario press release, pasted it in, and it started a dialogue about cell phone use in school and some of the issues involved with that. Speaking of the issue which is bound to come up either from the live audience or online is what happens, okay, the instructor, let's say, would upload their work and give it to their students, while is ChatGPT going to ingest that and use that material for training? The answer is absolutely no, it will not. It will not, because the way we have it set up through this, what's called API access to ChatGPT, the default, in fact, is do not use that material for training purposes. And you'd have to actually allow that to happen if you wanted it to happen, which of course we don't. So all our tools then, none of the information, we have a privacy policy and at the bottom of the page if you want to follow that, but all of our tools do not allow any storage of material on ChatGPT, nor do we allow it like for training purposes. We do have a record at Contact North, available to only the researchers. However, it's totally anonymous. All we would know from tonight's session that somebody asked about the Berlin Wall at a certain time, we would have no idea, no information about the IP address even of that person, because you'll notice there's no login. This is a tool that's completely free, freely available, no credit card required, no login required, so it is anonymous. There's pros and cons. We don't really know who's using the tool. In that sense, we can track worldwide, sort of through Google Analytics, how often the tool is being used, but we have no idea who's using it. So that's one thing that I think can reassure many faculty. So what's ahead? That's the next topic I want to highlight is, stop time, yes. We're going on a path of a number of possibilities. As I said, we've got multilingual capabilities, which I could demonstrate later if people are interested. We're introducing the idea of what I'm calling learning shorts. Students will be able to generate videos on a particular topic, say a 2-minute video on a topic. It could be Newton's laws of motion. They could have it, or thermodynamics. They could generate that short explanatory video on that. So what we're doing really here is scratching the surface, trying to demonstrate the potential of AI really to benefit education overall. And happy to answer any questions as we move into that phase next, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we now come to the exciting part. There were so many issues, really interesting issues raised in all 3 talks. So let's get to some questions. Would anybody in the audience like to start with a question?
Why don't we want ChatGPT and the others to read all the academic papers in the world, as long as they give proper credit?
Okay, anyone want to take that one up?
I would say we do, but the big challenge is the proper credit. Right now, ChatGPT cannot credit the exact source, and we are working on a project. I know where I was limited for time. There's a collection of textbooks called OpenStax. It's about 70 peer-reviewed open educational resources. And we're working on a project which we hope we'll be able to release in the next month or 2, where you will be able to search this corpus of peer-reviewed textbooks and know the exact chapter where that answer is coming from. So it's difficult. The tool Perplexity that was mentioned, that is a tool that can cite sources. We'll see what my colleagues have to say about that issue as well.
Anyone else?
Who mentioned?
I don't think I made that claim.
Oh, I saw someone had Perplexity on the screen.
I had Perplexity.
Yeah, okay, yeah, you didn't really dwell on it.
No, I agree with you. I don't think
yeah.
I would want to restrict them from being trained on all the published research material. Absolutely not. I think there's a bit of a shift at the moment, I think, around the sourcing of training data for these models. The initial versions, like the GPT, OpenAI ones, essentially were, let's get everything we can. And there's even evidence that, some pretty unsavory parts of the internet went into some of these training sets, right? So there's all that kind of stuff in there as well. And I think at the time, these organizations were really trying to understand how far they could push the models, right? So the early versions of these, I think, surprised everybody, right, in terms of how capable they were. I mean, just look at the opening that we had, to the whole event, and some of the examples like the poem one that I put up, right? So, I mean, these are really surprising, and I think one of the things that we've realized more recently is that you can be a lot more selective with your data set training, as Ron was mentioning as well, and there's examples of smaller, well-curated data sets going into building the sort of next generation of models, and maybe domain-specific data sets as well. So that's a big area of kind of current activity, I think, is data set curation for these.
Yeah, and my heart agrees with all of that. And then, but because we're a panel, I'll be a little bit hesitant. I mean, I think, I can't believe I'm going to defend copyright, but, there is, copyright, especially in the United States, I think has expanded beyond what maybe the reasonable intent of the founding fathers was, or the reasonable balance between rights holders and researchers. It does seem to have gone out of whack in the United States. But fundamentally, copyright is there to protect authors. And I think it does need to be approached sensitively, and especially the for-profit AI models, I mean, they are profiting massively off the intellectual property of authors. And it's easy for us to dismiss some of the large commercial publishers, but ultimately those still are authors. And so I think on the one hand, they need to work more around copyright. And then secondly, I don't think attribution is there. The data gets into the training model, but attribution is still not perfect. And it's still, as you saw from the example, literature reviews get all messed up. I've done some literature reviews, and I kind of get the vibe that 70% is right, and then 30% is confabulated, or somehow the context has gotten wrong. And so I think if it wants to read everything, it needs to work with the publishers. They need to really navigate the copyright issues. That's going to let scholars and others feel more secure in using it. Like, think of the image training data sets. There's a reason that Adobe's AI generation is not as good as Midjourney. But Adobe was trained on a copyright cleared corpus of images. So if somebody at my university wants to use that for an image on an annual report, I'm comfortable. Somebody wants to use an AI image generated from Midjourney on an annual report, I'm less comfortable because there's a chance it's committing flagrant copyright violation. And then just as an author, I worry about the loss of context. Every author hates when our work is used out of context. We can't control that, but it always hurts us when it happens, right? And AI will use our work out of context all the time, and so I think that's why that copyright issue is key. So,
I think just to add to that as well, there's a couple of different kind of, I don't know what you might call them, competencies or kind of parts of what these systems are actually doing at the same time. So one is the ability to produce formally correct, effective language, right? And then the other one is the ability to actually essentially act as a kind of fuzzy database that's able to retrieve information, right? So if we think about, and we're actually doing both of those things simultaneously when we use something like ChatGPT, we're asking for something and it's drawing on information, and then it's taking that information and putting it into something that is written well in a formal sense, right? So I think it's important to recognize that they're actually two totally separate tasks, right? And that's where I think this RAG approach is a lot more promising. So, because then it doesn't rely on, this was trained on the corpus of the internet up to this cutoff date, and then after that there's nothing. Actually, we pull in sources that we can attribute to, and then we use the language model essentially to actually generate the sort of the linguistic competence part of the tool, right? Now it would be nice to believe that we could achieve that kind of clean separation. I think technically that probably isn't possible, because of the kind of statistical nature of the way it generates language. Is also drawing on sources which are themselves contain content, right? So it's not content free. So I think we probably can't achieve that, but some of the better architected tools like Perplexity will enable you to do that. So it will remove some of the confabulation and also add some of the attribution that you would need. Does that make sense? I think there's still a challenge there about how to do that and how far we can actually separate those things.
I'm ready to fund Peter's work. No.
Oh, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
At the college where I worked, we frequently, especially in college English courses, found that students, international students, and some Canadian educated students hadn't got a foggy notion what copyright was. And how can this tool help them?
Well, I don't know, I could take a stab. I've experienced that very same thing, and the student, this is way before ChatGPT, the student was actually floored, had no idea that what he had copied, that must have been from the internet at that point, that was not proper way to approach things. A student in a graduate program who would come to Canada just for that program. Well, it's only through modeling in class with the students that you're going to be able to do this. And showing what, using, you have to first of all acknowledge that ChatGPT and all the similar tools exist. Show how they can be used to improve the writing. It may not necessarily get at the actual source of the writing and the ideas, but let's say the student comes up with a draft of an article, you can then say, well, run it through ChatGPT and show me the comparison between the two products and see what you've learned from that process. That's sort of one way to approach it, but it's a challenging way. And in some ways, generative AI is going to be probably redefining what it means by copyright and fair use of material and so on. And unfortunately, we're just going to leave it to the courts, it looks like, to decide that, which we don't know which way they'll go. There's arguments, pros and cons. We'll see. We'll see what happens. And whether the judges, if it goes to a jury trial, they'll understand what's going on before making their ruling. We just don't know.
Okay, I have a question from online. In what ways do you see the proliferation of AI technologies affecting how we address digital literacy with learners? Is it enough to know how to use the tool, or should we aim for all students to get some conceptual idea of how the technology works, even if they are not in CS or mathematical streams?
I can do a very quick kickoff and then maybe hand it over to Ian, because what I wanted to say was I was really glad that a non-computer scientist introduced how these things work today, because those kinds of explanations are often better than the ones that I could do. So I think the introduction that Ian gave was great about how they work, right? Playing those language games. I mean, you've obviously had experience like explaining this to people within your university, right? So that's, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it is key that we'd already pre this AI explosion been talking, I think in fairly nebulous terms about the importance of digital literacy and being aware of the role algorithms play in our life and how search engines work. And that probably turned what was a somewhat academic conversation into something that's really necessary. You know, what you said, maybe half of students, I'm sure it's about half of students, and many more are playing with this. And I think not that they need to know the nuts and bolts, but I think having a conceptual understanding of what's going on, where does it get its information, what is it good at, what can you actually trust this thing to do with 100% certainty. There's things that I trust these models to do for me because I understand what's going on. It's like I'm using Stack Overflow, which is a coding website of question and answer. It's developing stuff that I can then verify and check the ground truth of something. And then, as you say, there's other things where I asked about Enoch Turner, and it could have said the right thing, or it could have said complete nonsense. And because I didn't check it, I just took it on faith, right? And that's what we don't want our students to do. We definitely don't want our professors of history doing that. So the trick then is how to bake it into the curriculum. And ideally, it's not in like CS 101. Ideally, it's probably in the high schools. Or if it's at a university, it's in some kind of common curriculum. Just like we're teaching our students how to write paragraphs, we need to teach them how to understand at a very high level these kinds of tools.
Yeah, I'd say it absolutely has to be part of the curriculum, built in, integrated. I would say that these efforts at coding schools, teaching kids to code, are probably going to fade out, because that's not the future for those kids who are in school now, and certainly not in elementary school. Those jobs are disappearing because AI is going to be doing it. Sure, you're going to need some coders, but it's not the bright future we saw maybe even 5 years ago for coders. So the focus now has got to be more on AI literacy and understanding how it works, and not in a real technical sense, but in a general sense in terms of accuracy and those issues, and appropriate use. So very important.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, I'd just like to add my voice. I think that the idea of a common module or something on AI literacy for all students within a university, and probably staff as well, would be really wise to consider right now if you're not already doing that.
Okay, thank you. We've got two questions, one after another from the floor, so please.
Hi. I was wondering if this tool has the capacity of writing in a different level or producing information in a different level. For example, the poem that you asked for, and it recited a poem at that level, can a grade 3 student do this and ask for this, which should be different from yours, with the mention that you have the cognitive capacity. So is it possible to provide such a different material?
So if I understand your question, you're asking if you can get the tool to behave in different ways like different sorts of people.
Exactly,
Yes,
based on the, like an elementary student versus a grade student.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and I think, so Ron's example here is they've got it behaving like a tutor, right, in one sense, so that's a really good example. One of the things we haven't really touched on in this is there's an emerging kind of skill called prompt engineering, which is something that you might want to go and look up, and you can even have a bit of fun with yourself, which is the prompt that you put into something like ChatGPT or a Llama model or something like that, really kind of conditions the model on what its behavior is going to be afterwards. So we're used to just, say, asking a question or saying, can you give me this? But you can do some quite elaborate things in there. So you can say things like, please pretend that you are an angry 5-year-old who's annoyed because they haven't had any candy today. And now I want you to try and persuade me that I should take you out to McDonald's instead, right? So, and it will do it. It'll be really convincing, right? So you can get it to behave like that. You can also get it to behave like, pretend that you're a Victorian school teacher and try and teach me how to do my handwriting or something, right? So you can get it to role play in these different ways and to change its tone. And that's actually one of the skills that I think, one of the capabilities, I think, that are really quite useful, because perhaps you have a student who can articulate their idea well enough, but maybe they haven't really learned how to write it in a sort of the formal academic style that you would expect yet. And so you can actually say, I've got this text, could you please rewrite it in a way that is in line with academic standards, academic style, for example. And then it will do that, and again, you should check it, because it may have, introduced something else or missed something or kind of misunderstood one of the arguments or something like that. But at least as a learning tool, that could be quite useful, because I think somebody said, the student can then compare pre and post and understand the changes that have been made, and hopefully use that as a learning opportunity to be able to look at the sort of the way in which those passages are constructed. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if I could add that's the prompt engineering, Lynn, is one of the skills that would be part of the whole AI literacy. For instance, if Paul had put in his introductory remarks that we all laughed over, it was very entertaining, if he had put in that, explained who the audience would be, the professional audience, educated audience, and the various parameters, then it would have come back with entirely different language. Or he could have said, this is an introduction for grade 6 class to this topic, and the language, again, would be totally different. So it's prompt engineering. In our tool, we have that capability. I'm not going to, if you could bring up the screen for a second, I could just show you. I'm not going to go into any depth because we don't have the time, but I'll show you that we've built in that level of, oh, it's there, yeah, okay. So you see this undergraduate learning level, the default is for undergraduate. So you put your topic in, and then the language that comes back would simplify it. So if I put in, I'm not sure how well it would work with Einstein's theory of relativity, I could have that explain at either the elementary level, like in terms of elementary school students, high school, undergraduate, or a professional level. And hopefully, not always, the answers, depends on the actual topic, how the answers are going to be explained in a different way, in a simpler language. That's the idea. It's not so much that this is necessarily designed for elementary students. It's really trying to get a better name for this rather than learning level and calling it elementary. It gives the impression it's for elementary school students, but it's trying to simplify the language also for second language users of the tool, where English is their second language. And speaking of that, we do have the other languages here, so we can converse with the tool in other languages. So a student who is, whose first language is Japanese, they'll have the interface in English, but all the responses will be in Japanese, and instantly they're there. So,
do you see the future, like a future role, or whether like for good or for ill, of a government level involved in like AI within Canada? Because, you know, when you're thinking of how AI can quite, in some cases, very easily be subsumed within a lot of like really racist stuff, homophobic stuff, that again, because again, it's all user generated. So really did like in enough people, we see this happen sometimes. I mean, this happened, I believe, when Google came up with a chat bot, and like within like a day, it was quoting the 14 words. Like it had gone just absolutely, completely right wing in a very short amount of time, just because people were bored and wanted to screw with it. So do you see a role in some level of government sort of managing that and managing what's available for Canadians, Ontarians, especially when you're talking about incorporating AI literacy into the curriculum? Well, that would be a Ministry of Education thing. So do you see that there will eventually be kind of a bit more control within, and I mean from a Canadian perspective exclusively, or do you think this is really going to be something that cannot be controlled by any level of government?
well, I'll give it a shot at that.
Go.
Well, yeah, it's a big question, and the government might set some guidelines on appropriate use, and the tools themselves are realizing what's happening, and what they are essentially has been pointed out, that they're reflecting the general information on the internet, what is said. And so now I was just reading today that OpenAI has publicly posted their guidelines, their general guidelines, and how it's going to be used and constructed. And they gave it a simple example. We're not talking about racist content here, but how to be a better shoplifter. If you try that right now, I haven't tried it, it should block you from that. You can ask about shoplifting, how do I decrease the shoplifting in my business, but it should be blocking now that. So they're becoming more and more aware of that, and public concern. In the early days with ChatGPT, people were trying to get the most racist, vilest information out of it, and that has been largely controlled, but not entirely, absolutely not entirely. So government may come in with general guidelines, but we have our general charter and so on, and the possibility of legal action, but if offensive content is there, but I don't know how that would be that effective. Public pressure, I think, is going to cause this to be more regulated, self-regulated by industry.
So, I mean, I'll take a stab at this as well. So I think just for the record, it was a Microsoft chatbot, not a Google one, just before we get sued by Google or something.
I apologize to Google.
Yeah, and there are real risks, right? I think this is really important to understand, is that when you can ask it for essentially for any of the world's knowledge at your fingertips to be able to do something. So, you know, one that came up in some conversations I was at last week were people saying, oh, please give me instructions to build a chemical weapon. Right? Is a classic example, right? And so the models that are being released at the moment have what we call guardrails around those, which is what Ron was talking about, which are trained in a sort of a separate training process that comes afterwards, right? That should block it from doing those kinds of things. Things get through, and some of those guardrails can be really quite funny sometimes. When you hit them, they can kind of stumble upon them while you're interacting with it. But in general, that's the sort of a technical approach that's taken to try and mitigate some of that risk. But in terms of regulation and legislation, so I mean, there are worldwide efforts to legislate around AI at the moment. So the European Union has just passed the AI Act over there, which does a bunch of things, such as, for example, restricting the use of face detection technologies for most purposes. It defines classes of AI use and is particularly focused on the causing harm and regulating around causing harm and having like essentially like lists of applications that are kind of audited and permitted in those kinds of spaces. Canada has currently has the AI and Data Act that's going through Parliament at the moment. There's a recent open letter to take that back to the drawing board a little bit and engage in wider consultation. I don't know what will happen with that. I follow this kind of with interest, but it's not something I work directly in that space. The Canadian Act does, to a large extent, follow the same kind of pattern as the EU Act. There are some differences, but it's sort of its spirit. I think a lot of it is the same. It focuses on trying to identify places where AI could cause harm, and then to restrict or to regulate those kinds of uses. Yeah.
And just to quickly add, I think we're going to see, even outside of that national context, regulatory pressures in all sorts of different facets of society to ensure there's greater disclosure and greater transparency around the use of artificial intelligence. And, another example complementary to that is, within the university sector, we've been thinking about how to safeguard research, and the government has made it really clear that we need to safeguard, for example, research that is advancing artificial intelligence. So, if you've got a training data set of a bunch of people, or if you're doing something really cutting edge, we also need to be conscious that that doesn't fall into a bad actor in a national security sense. And so I think we're already seeing, even underneath that big umbrella of, pan-Canadian AI legislation, already we're seeing regulators, we're seeing draft guidance that's going to require people to compel things. And, obviously hanging over it is the two things hanging over it is obviously hate speech, which is criminal code, and then probably the United States, which does have a fairly unique and open legal context. And so it'll be interesting how that dovetails with Canadian EU legislation.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions here. The first one is, how should professors rethink assignments and exams in the light of AI? Any sort of advice? Who wants to tackle that?
Yeah. I mean, my default it's a really good question, and I think if there was an easy answer, we would give it, and there isn't. My sense is whenever these kinds of disruptive things happen, for me as an educator, I've taught in universities for about 15 years or so, I always kind of think, well, let's go back to the learning outcomes. What is it that I want the students to learn, and what experiences do I need to design for them to be able to have that learning opportunity and experience? So maybe, I'm not going to accuse anyone individually of this, but maybe we've got a bit too comfortable or a little bit lazy with saying, write a report on this, right? And that demonstrates to me that you've digested it and understood it. And actually that's probably not the case necessarily anymore now, because we can just produce reports on things, right, by asking one of these models to do it. So I think we do need to rethink some of those things. There are ways, of course, that you can kind of scaffold. If you think that actually, the production of an essay is a really important skill that someone needs to develop, well, you can scaffold that process, right? So you can say, okay, let's come to me with an outline and present it to me, and we'll discuss it. And then, let's look at how you're going to articulate this, or how have you chosen your sources, and kind of like look a little bit more at the process. If what you really care about is actually the learning process and not the artifact at the end, which I think should be the case for something like an essay, then maybe a redesign that looks more at the process of the development of the essay rather than just summatively evaluates the output. It'd probably be one approach.
Yeah.
And I pick on take-home exams in my talk today, but I think in part it's forcing faculty that I know to step up their game a bit. And that was, in history, the take-home exam, I think, became the site of a lot of these problems, because we'd had these effectively exams in a lot of history classes had turned into content regurgitation. They had moved home during COVID-19, and then they had not moved back to campus. And so we actually had many classes across like the North American history higher ed sector, where you had students writing take-home content regurgitation. And it turns out ChatGPT excels at that level of like effectively summarize some course notes, summarize some publicly available information, make a narrative. And in that case, it's useful for the faculty member to sit back and think, okay, what are my learning objectives? Why was I having them regurgitate content? That probably isn't actually what we should be doing at the university level. And, not to throw them under the bus, COVID was brutal, but like it's forcing us to rethink the scope of those take-home exams. And that's probably a good thing for our learners and for our teachers.
Yeah, if I could just comment as well, the knee-jerk reaction has been a return to invigilated exams, both essay and other forms of exams. That's the knee-jerk reaction, and I think there has been somewhat of a swing that way, but the long-term solution is not that. I think it's to be making the work more project-based, long-term project-based, describing how you're using ChatGPT or other tools, presenting both versions, perhaps the version you began with, the revised version, and so on. But unfortunately, that is probably putting more burden on instructors because they may have to look at not only the drafts and multiple drafts and then the final product. So that's one issue, but I think it's going to sort itself out over time. It has to sort itself over time, making projects more personal-based as well. So the individual has to apply the concepts discussed in class to their personal situation, their personal lived experience. So on these are some ways you can approach that. It's going to be a struggle, but many people have started working at solutions. And the US organization EduCause, they have a teaching and learning newsletter that comes out every several weeks, and you'll see some examples of how faculty are changing assessment on all different subject areas. That may be one worth looking at. I'm sorry, no, that's the Chronicle of Higher Education, not EduCause. EduCause has got some very valuable material as well, but the Chronicle of Higher Education is the one I was mentioning.
Okay, well, we're going to cut off the questions now, but thank you so much to everybody, the audience here and at home, and for all of you for your participation. And I'm going to turn it back to Lynn to have some closing thoughts. Thank you.
Well, a very sincere thanks for adding to our understanding of the complexities and the possibilities based on your research. It's been terrific, and I've enjoyed it, and I've learned, and I think we can all add to that. Thank you all for coming. I hope to see you again in future programs here at the Schoolhouse. Good night.